We have chosen a subject this morning which I feel has very interesting and stimulating ramifications. Of course, we are dealing essentially with a past situation, but at the same time, out of the past comes a great deal of information and help which we can variously apply to our problems today. Ancient religion and philosophy, in those golden eras in which they exercised their maximum influence upon the culture of mankind, these institutions were largely institutions of ritual. In ritual in this case, I mean initiation rites and ceremonies in connection with the worship of the deities. The kind of congregational religion that we know today did not exist at that time, and broadly speaking, does not exist today outside of the general boundaries of Christendom. For the most part, in ancient times, religion divided into two processes or functions. One was private worship, and the second was the state mysteries. Private worship meant that the temples of the deities were open and available at all times. Those seeking spiritual consolation attended these temples when and as the needs of their own lives required. As religion was part of the state function, it followed, of course, that the average person took his problems almost immediately to the altars of his faith. The temples themselves were attended by priestly orders of persons who were unusually equipped, for the most part, for their religious functions. The priests of antiquity were also initiates of the state mysteries. Most of them were philosophers. Many of them were deeply versed in the rudiments of what we call today the exact sciences. This meant that, in general, the priestly group represented the best informed, most enlightened, best educated persons of their time. Their education was not solely in religious matters. Rather, they were generally educated and dedicated to religion. Thus they brought to the temples of their faiths whatever abilities, knowledges, and arts and crafts which they possessed. And as a result, within the body of the hierarchy or sacerdotal structure were found individuals of extraordinary personal erudition. Thus it would follow that these served as counselors, fulfilling the problems that we now associate with many learned professions. In general, they were sought out in almost every phase of human activity. They were sought for legal advice, for medical advice. They were regarded as the authorities on almost all of the daily problems of mankind. Normally, they arbitrated personal and family disputes. They had much to do with the administering of laws, and it was customary for persons with various legal situations or in litigation to bring their problems to the temples. Here, the final verdicts of the priests were usually accepted. Thus, the temple constituted the clinic, in many instances the hospital, and its functions reached into every phase of the normal life of the people. We can also realize from this how deep and broad the effect of religion was in society. It was not a separate institution. It was not something that the individual joined privately. He was born into the faith of his people. He was therefore inclined to turn to the temple for help and for guidance. Young men choosing professions were instructed, were examined as to their abilities, receiving a great part of what we would call today psychological investigation. They were given what might be termed their IQ test in the temple. And the recommendations again of the priestly group were regarded as scriptural. Now this had a very deep effect upon society. But we must now pause also and realize that religions, philosophies, sciences must always come finally face to face with human nature. That which man does not choose to do, no faith can force him to do. If he does not have some natural instinct or inclination in a certain direction, no amount of theological conditioning can compel him to a code of action. Therefore, we must recognize that in these times, in these older times, there were those also who rejected religion or refused the ministrations of philosophy. But for the most part, I think that the cultures of the time were seated in their religious experience. Young people were brought up to respect religion. They respected it not only because their parents belonged to a certain faith. This was not the case. They respected it because their community, their nation, almost their race, respected this type of belief. There was no contrary sophistry. There was no undermining or belittling of spiritual values. Nor were these values regarded as something separate from life as we live it. Now, of course, such a condition as this would prevent a great many religious problems that we face today. We face a considerable amount of religious division, due in part to the young person not being certain or sure of the relation of society to religion. Today, many intellectuals have almost completely rejected religious life. And many of our higher institutions of learning, which are modern reflections of the ancient temple structures, are comparatively non-religious. As a result, there is a loss of psychological energy in this direction. There is also loss of psychological conditioning of the individual to regard certain principles as essentially sound and necessary. Today, therefore, we can see the need for something that these people possessed, but we do not see the machinery for achieving it. Modern man does not, generally speaking, admire or particularly endorse state religions. He does not feel that he wishes to have the temple take the place of the city hall. Probably could not afford to do so under the conditioning through which we have passed in the last 500 years. As a result, one phase of religion, private worship, the private consultation of the learned religious elder, this has disappeared from our way of life. Yet, although we have deprived ourselves or have been deprived by circumstances of this type of spiritual consolation, there is no evidence of the fact that we no longer need it. Rather, we now find it necessary to make personal decisions in these matters. These personal decisions, of course, do conflict with our modern concept of congregational religion. The ancient did not favor this for the simple reason that he felt that it removed from religion its dynamic impact upon the person. Religion must be something that we choose, that we call upon as we need it, that we serve as our own instincts and ideals impel us to serve. It receives the dignity that we are willing to confer upon it. And in the extension of this thinking, the quiet, private solution of the religious problem is certainly strongly indicated. And it is quite possible that the emergencies of our time will again emphasize the need of this basic religious instruction. This brings us to the second phase of the first part of our argument, namely the qualification of the hierarchy or clergy to administer the various needs that originally form part of religious life. Today we have a tendency to train people in religion, in religious institutions, in theological seminaries, largely for ministerial responsibility and duty. According again to the natures of these individuals, they therefore go out with as diversified an attitude toward their profession as we find in medicine or law, engineering, or any other of the skilled phases of modern thinking. We are not always certain that even within the structure of religion itself, that we are dealing with essentially dedicated persons. This again is due naturally to the environmental situation. The young theological student of today is not educated with the concept of the full measure of the importance of his own career in life. He may be enthusiastic, he may be sincere, he may be devout, but then what are his other qualifications? And the majority of modern theologians could not have passed the qualifications that were set up in Athens 500 years before the beginning of the Christian era. If you take the average minister into the temple as it was functioning then, you take the modern clergyman and sit him down with a board of temple examiners, there is a little question as to how well he'd come out. I'm rather suspecting that he wouldn't get, always at least, exceptionally high grades. For instance, supposing we took the average clergyman today and set him down to work out advanced problems in higher mathematics as part of his necessary equipment. Supposing we expected him to produce a learned, scientifically accurate discourse or dissertation on abstract astronomy, he might not do too well. In fact, there's much reason to think that he would perhaps have a little trouble. He might also have trouble if he was confronted with the classical examination in comparative religion, where he would be expected to know just as much about other faiths as the ones to which he belonged. Supposing we took the average clergyman today, pick him out of the phone book, and ask him to write 100 or 200 pages of classical information, perfectly annotated, well documented, on Buddhism, Hinduism, or Brahmanism, I think he'd have trouble. We might also find that he wasn't able to handle the fine points of distinction between Plato and Aristotle too admirably. And we might find him limited in the pharmacopoeia. He might not be able to diagnose almost any form of disease accurately. In other words, to pass those older examinations, he would have to be able to pass a modern bar examination in law. He would have to be able to secure his doctorate in medicine, and he would have to probably be an expert in at least 3 to 5 major sciences. Now we say, what has this to do with religion? To the ancient, it had a great deal to do with religion, because religion was responsible for all of society. It was presumed and assumed that the lawyer would come to the temple of his God just exactly as quickly as a layman. The lawyer would expect to have religion unfolded for him on a level of universal legality. He would expect to be instructed in universal law. He would expect to be shown how man-made law was rooted in divine law. He might bring a very complicated case, perhaps one which would cause modern attorneys to have countless conferences before they were able to work it out. He was supposed to present it to the priests of the temple, and they were to come up with the correct answer under any and all conditions, or at least an answer correct enough so that everyone involved was satisfied. Justice had to be part of religion. The control and directing of science had to be part of religion. For in Greece, it would have been a very unhappy situation entirely had some astronomer come out and announced himself an atheist. It just wasn't acceptable. Now, we may say that some were not in full accord with the religious problem of their time. That is true. We know, for example, that Socrates was rather skeptical in many matters. But this skepticism which he had was on a secondary level of skepticism. And presented with the serious problems of life, he again had recourse to his understanding of the divine will and the divine nature. He never attempted to transcend religion. Rather, he attempted to interpret it, correct it, purify it, and regenerate it where necessary, but always within the broad concept of the faith itself. He was an interpreter and a philosopher of religions, but he was not an atheist. In this type of thinking, then, we can see why, for many centuries, the world moved around a solid religious core, and that from this motion we had some of the noblest arts and sciences developed and brought to a comparatively high degree of perfection. There are very few discoveries, even in nuclear physics today, that were not anticipated in the temples long ago. And also at that time, moral instruction in the use of knowledge was heavily emphasized to prevent, if possible, the very disaster that we are in today. Gradually, however, our concepts of religion changed. And as a result of a loss of conceptual vitality, our religious life has become more or less something separate from our regular conduct, something that perhaps we call upon only in an emergency, rather than to recognize it as an ever-present help, not only in trouble, but in the administering of prosperity and success. The second phase of the major problem of religion in those days was the ritual or the public festival. The ancients celebrated various important days associated with their faiths, a practice which has still continued to a more limited degree in modern religion, where we do have such holidays as Easter, and in many faiths a number of days dedicated to saints or to various religious occasions. However, in the Grecian world, these were festivals in which all of the people participated. The religious festivals were great processionals. They were great public spectacles in which the entire community united in giving thanks for the various benefits and privileges which men enjoyed. There were festivals for the seasons. Men realized that it was necessary for the farmer to sow and to guard his crop and to bring in the harvest. But they believed definitely that it was the right of men to labor but that the fruitfulness of the earth was the gift of God. Therefore, in all human endeavor, we succeeded only because we had available to us the divine fact, the universal system of fecundity, by which things were replenished and renewed forever in nature. So men were gardeners, but they never took upon themselves the credit for the harvest. They realized that if they neglected it, it would not come. But that if they were serious and dedicated, it would come. Not because they could make the grain to grow, but because the ever-presence of deity made all things fruitful. Thus the festivals of all kinds were largely festivals of thanksgiving. And while to a certain measure some of these festivals were tragic, the majority of them were occasions of great celebration and joy. The Greeks especially were not people to worship dismal beliefs. They believed in a good universe. And this is something where, again, perhaps we can learn something from them. They lived their own way. They had their great culture. It finally fell under the power of the Roman Empire and disintegrated as all material things must finally fail. But during the glorious centuries, the age of Pericles, which within 300 years produced over 600 of the world's greatest minds, during this wonderful period of this golden age of enlightenment, men worshipped essentially the concept of a good universe. A universe in which mistakes, if they were made, were mostly mistakes made by men. And that our misunderstanding brought upon us the griefs and tragedies of the various centuries and generations. But nature itself was good. Nature wanted man to be happy. Nature wanted man to worship joyfully and to live in a constant sense of appreciation, rejoicing over the universal good which he enjoyed. When men began more and more to be pessimistic about these things, their pessimisms began to affect their institutions, and little by little the quiet joy of religion gave place to fears and doubts and uncertainties which have plagued us even to this time. The public ceremonies and festivals, of course, were derived from very ancient authority. And in the history of Greek religion and of Egyptian religion, we can go back to about 1400 BC, and then things begin to get rather dim. We no longer see the clear outlines of doctrines or ideas. But even then, we can hear in the distant time, in the darkness that preceded that period of enlightenment, we can still hear the chanting of the priests. We can still see the shadows of the ancient processionals. We can still see ritual emerging from the savage and barbaric life of man. We also see this in contemporary areas where cultures are still in the process of development. We see all over the world among so-called primitive peoples the continuance of ritualism. We see that man gradually built these great religious institutions from certain primary convictions of his own life. Ritual perhaps arose in tribal beliefs and in the taboos and doctrines which we still find practiced in remote parts of Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Most rituals have to do with meaning. Very few rituals of any kind arose from inadequate causes. They were not social situations. They were not just because somebody wanted to do it. We can't even find who created or brought into existence any of the essential ritualisms. They are universally distributed. They were practiced by the ancient American Indians, by the higher cultures of Latin America and South America. They were practiced by the shamans of Siberia, by the lamas of Tibet, by the ancient Aya priests of India. Everywhere throughout the world, men worshipped through ritual. And ritual had to do with a form of doctrinal system which arose from conduct. One of the things that ritual meant was participation. The individual was constantly taking part in the spiritual life of his people. Every period of his life was under certain directive. Certain inspiration or ideal moved him to be the best person that he could be. Now, if he was of comparatively primitive background, this best person might be a comparatively primitive individual. But it has been noted by anthropologists even now that among primitive peoples there are integrities which we have almost totally lost. We have lost them simply because we have divided them from the great concept of life, which originally gave them vitality and meaning. A ritual that is not meaningful, that is not part of life itself, can have very little constructive effect upon the conduct of the person. So we had public ceremonials. We had various means of setting forth the joy, the gratitude, the acceptance of peoples. And we had various rituals to give thanks for certain specific or special benefits that were held to be above all other consideration. One of the interesting types of ritual, for example, which we have entirely forgotten, was the original ritual of the Olympiads. We still have the Olympic Games. We revised them. But the Olympic Games, as you realize, did begin or were most highly celebrated among the Greeks. Though, even in those days, Greece was not always at peace. There were provinces and areas that produced ambitious persons, and there were troubles with other neighboring peoples who did not participate in the Greek way of life. Therefore, it wasn't always a particularly easy or convenient thing to bring all of these states together amicably for the purpose of ritual. But here nature gave a very valuable guide, the guide of salt. The term salt today simply means something we use to make our food more tasty. From it, of course, comes the word salary, because ancient Roman soldiers were paid in salt for their military duties. Also came another word, salvation, which is preservation by means of salt. Now, we have forgotten the meanings of these words. They no longer have great vitality for us. But if you go out in the jungle, you will find what salt means religiously in nature. You will find here and there, scattered through the mysteries of an untamed underbrush, the salt licks, or the places where animals go for salt. And wherever there is a place of salt in the jungle, there is a place of peace. The tiger and the lion and the leopard respect it. And you will find the most dangerous animals going for their salt alongside of the most harmless and gentle of creatures. A traveler coming back not long ago from Africa reported seeing a group of lions at a salt lick taking salt alongside of a group of antelopes. Under normal condition, there'd be no peace between these two. But where the salt is, there is peace. Now, our forefathers took this thought in mind, and the Greeks developed this idea that for certain reasons there could be peace. This was brought into the Olympic Games at a comparatively early time, when it was decided when and where the games were to be held. The priests came forth before the altars and dedicated these games. And at this time they held up a peculiar sacred plaque and revealed it to the people. And when this plaque was presented or held up before the people, there was peace. There had to be. All private and public feud had to stop. If there was war, the war had to be postponed. Nothing could break the sacred peace, because in this peace, men came together for peaceful purposes, purposes of competition on the level of peace, however, of exploits, of orations, of all of the various activities, because in the old days the Olympic Games also included tests in mathematics. And the individual who squared the circle or made a quadrature of the right angle was crowned with laurel and carried before the public with a vast congress of people, maybe 60 or 70,000 cheering people, cheering a mathematician. This doesn't happen much anymore. This type of thing is largely reserved for a prize fighter or a jazz musician or someone who has managed to square or right angle all of the harmony out of a musical composition. But where the sacred purposes of man, initiation into the mysteries, the sacred rites, or any religious ceremony was involved, there had to be peace, and all other considerations were forgotten. Now, we have to have something constructive to say about an attitude toward religion that made this possible. An attitude in which your enemy, the unbeliever, the non-believer, still respected and kept the faith. Just as in the case of the League of the Five Nations among the American Indians, where messengers or members of the League traveling in the most wild country, where perhaps were tribes that were not members of the League, who normally would be out to destroy parties of other tribes. But if these messengers carried the League belts, the wampum belts bearing the insignia of the League, there was no American Indian on the continent who would disregard them. This was a type of thing that came from a broad belief. And if the world today had developed this phase of its consciousness along with other phases, the great temple universities of the mysteries could simply say at this moment, there will be no bombs, and there would be no bombs, and that's it. But we have lost the background which made this possible. We have lost the spiritual authority which could come forth before all men and declare the things that should be and the things that must be. The peculiar custodian of this, the carrier that should have survived, was the perpetuation of the mysteries themselves through the great educational institutions. In other words, what we call today the university is the long shadow of the Eleusinian mysteries. But the shadow is too thin. We are too far from the source of its light. There is no longer burning in the midst of the university the great altar of the unknown God. There is no longer this absolute dedication which says that no man or no woman can attend this college or this university who does not first of all, before himself, his gods, and his hierarchy, takes the solemn obligation that no learning that he ever attains for any reason shall be used for selfish reasons or to injure any other living creature. Now, if this was a prerequisite to education, we might have a little different pattern. But all that disappeared in those days that we call superstition-ridden. And we now live in these good times when no man dares to trust anybody. This is our situation. Now, beyond the great physical ceremonies by means of which religion was administered, was the final and greater authority of all, and that was the religious mysteries, the ritual. The individual derived this ritual very largely from primitive sources, and we still know from modern parallels approximately where it came from. All of this ancient ritual was originally based upon a quiet, thoughtful observation of the life of the individual. It not only was based upon this, but based upon an internal meditation upon this life. It was a study of life meaning. It was an effort to capture the universal purpose and glorify it among men, so that the human being became a servant of a plan that might be sometimes difficult to observe or difficult to fully verify, but a plan which is revealed to us in such an infinite diversity of ways that we know that this plan exists. The simple problem of the plan itself arises in the life of the human being. Man is born into this world. He comes in a state of comparative helplessness. And the story of his life is, of course, cleverly set forth in the riddle of the Sphinx. Because man first crawls, then walks, and then leans upon the ancient staff. The child coming into the world comes in to be protected, to be guarded, to be provided for by his parents, and if necessary, by his community. Therefore, each child who comes into the world is a sacred gift to mankind, a gift in whose hands will sometime be placed the destiny of the future. The child is therefore, to man, the greatest asset that humanity can have. It is the continuing evidence of God's determination to preserve his kind or his species. And it was therefore held from the very beginning that the whole structure of the tribe should be developed around the concept of making the new member come to his maturity in the best and wisest way, so that in the years to come, the tribe would enjoy an unbroken descent of enlightened citizens. To neglect the child was to destroy the future. When the child was brought into the world, in Egypt particularly, it was given a milk name. That was its infant name. That was the name which its parents lovingly called it through its early childhood. But this was not its mature name, because in ancient times, every child had to earn his name. He had to earn his citizenship. He had to earn his right to be one of his people. And so at the proper time came the puberty rights, the rites of initiation into the tribe, the rite of initiation into the meaning of life. No child could be allowed to grow up without the fundamental questions of life being answered at a time most appropriate and meaningful to that child. The child had to learn that life was not merely an opportunity to do as he pleased. Life was a sacred dedication to value. Now, to try to take one modern child out of a heterogeneous situation and convey this to him is extremely difficult, because the contrary influence of those around him will make the problem almost impossible. But in those days, this was the proper way. The child would have been as miserable had it been neglected in these matters as the modern child would be if it was disciplined in them. It was unthinkable. It was unbelievable in terms of status that anyone could grow up without this instruction. And it would be a serious neglect, a crime against the child and against society, for these matters to be neglected in any degree whatsoever. The child was early taken to the temple for purification and for dedication. The child was brought up all through its early years in the presence of this great realization of the privilege of belonging to his people. That he was fortunate indeed and wonderfully privileged that he might have the opportunity to learn, that he might have the opportunity to grow up to become a useful and valuable person. So when the time came for the puberty rites, he was solemnly initiated into the ritual and mystery of his people. Both boys and girls were initiated. Each had their own ceremonies, but equally solemn and equally vital. For it was the duty of these rituals to convey to these young people the real meaning of life. They were tested not only as to their physical strength and endurance, but to their moral and emotional values. They were admonished, not by some method of just pressing on the child some virtue which it doesn't want, but they were taken into the whole story of life itself and were dramatically carried through the various stages of living. And finally, having performed their vigil, having made their solemn obligations, having been passed through fasting and testing, having received certain educational instruction, not necessarily in the primitive ritual was this education in terms of learning to read or write. It was learning to know and to understand. Many primitive peoples who have never learned to read or write are vastly learned, tremendously wise in the wisdom of things that are real. You can learn to read and write if you want to in ancient society. But to learn to be right and wrong, this was indispensably part of basic education, the education that was before reading and writing, before anything else in its vitality. I have known some wonderful people from among primitive groups, venerable and learned persons who have never learned to read or write, but whose wisdom in all things that are real was greater than the scholar of today who is measured in all these things. Because it is sometimes better to know what is necessary than to be able to read and write, and only able to read and write things that are unnecessary. This principle held fast. When the young person was initiated into his tribe, then he received his man or woman name. He was no longer a child. As Paul says, when he was a child, he acted as a child. But having become a man or woman, it was necessary to act in conformity with these standards. Irresponsibility and this perpetual adolescence problem that we suffer from today, practically unknown. Because these people wanted to grow up. They wanted to be useful. They received the tradition of their people. They knew what constituted acceptability. They knew that honor and integrity were the basis of distinction in life. So they grew into the pattern and were accepted into the body of their society. And even among slaves in old days, there were these rights. Rights that had to do with the person's inner fitness to govern himself, to bear with patience the burden of his time, to remain true in the presence of temptation, to remain brave in the presence of danger. These things were birthright, and each person was instructed in them. In many cases, this instruction went ritualistically one step further. Sometimes we wonder why this step was included, but I think if we are careful, we can understand why. Many of these rituals ended in a ceremony involving a mock death. This mock death was sometimes rather strenuously achieved. The individual might actually, by narcotic drugs, be made unconscious, or be struck a blow that rendered him unconscious, or in some oriental systems, made unconscious by means of pressure on nerve system centers. In other words, the individual had to experience the loss of consciousness, had to experience a kind of miniature death, a near-death, in order that certain fact might be made evident to him. And among some of the older schools, there are traditions as to why the candidate was required to pass through this semblance of death and to be raised again from it by a mystery ritual. The reason for this probably is that death is the supreme fear in the soul and life of man. It is the one terrible temptation which he faces to compromise his principles. Fear of pain, fear of physical injury, fear of death can weaken resolution, perhaps more than any other factors can. And many persons who have been brave in most situations have lost their courage when threatened with death. Consequently, the right person must take the simple attitude that even in the presence of the loss of life, principle must come first. So he was taken through a kind of pseudo-death in order that he might experience the temporary extinction of himself and realize that the mystery of death was not as terrible as he thought it was, that actually dying is not as difficult as living. And in facing this realization, he therefore was given courage against the bribery of fear, against the possibility of being tempted by physical violence to break these principles which he held to be necessary. In any event, this part of the ceremony was nearly always included in primitive ritualism. It was done for the very definite purpose of overcoming this last great adversary, as Milton calls it. This one thing by which more people have been caused to compromise their principles by fear than by any other purpose. Consider, for example, the present situation and recent situations in Europe and the present conditions behind the Iron Curtain. We can realize that the terror of pain, suffering, torture, and death have had a tremendous influence upon human character, that they have made many people compromise principles that otherwise they would have defended very stoutly and sincerely. After this situation, the person became ritualistically a citizen of his tribe. He was now regarded as fitted for responsibility. It was assumed that he could never fail. And among these initiates of the ancient mysteries, compromise or treason or dishonesty were almost unknown. They simply were not possible situations. The individual would not defile himself or face the wrath of his gods. It became a matter of survival by ethics rather than by a compromise of ethics. Thus the body of mankind was set up, socially and structurally. But the structure of society was then, as it has always been, and probably always will be, at least in reasonable, thinkable time, was divided into those who became the good citizen and those who pressed on to something else. And for those who wished to become important contributors in a specialized area, who wished to become teachers or leaders, or had hope and aspiration to become part of the great sacerdotal colleges themselves, by means of which these instructions were perpetuated, For them were reserved the greater mysteries, the great ritualistic ceremonies, by which the experience of religion was conveyed from one person to another. And this is where psychology steps in now, and where a considerable amount of research in ritualism has been done, particularly, of course, by authority of the ancient tradition. The dynamic ritualism is not as frequently found as it used to be, but even now among some peoples, ritual can be examined firsthand. Ritual has a quality, as Plato points out. It is something to revive something. Ritual reaches into man himself by reminiscence. These rituals, which were based upon a great formula of life, certainly did arise originally from the subconscious or unconscious parts of human nature. Therefore, the problem of ritual was that it revived. It caused the individual to remember out of himself certain truths locked in his own nature. The essential purpose of ritual was not to bestow or to convey, but to stimulate the consciousness of the person passing through the ritual, that something in himself might stir again out of the night of his own darkness and time. For Plato and Socrates both believed that there was a divine nature locked within man, a nature that was not theological in its divinity, but perhaps cosmological in its divinity. In other words, man contained within himself an archetypal pattern of the universal purpose. He knew but did not know that he knew the reason for himself. Now, a great many persons have had this experience to a somewhat limited degree. People come to me frequently and say, I went along through the years for 30, 40, 50 years, and all of a sudden I picked up a book or I met someone and they said something. And the moment they said this, I knew it was true. I'd never thought of it before, but I knew it was true. Many persons have had this feeling in connection with the doctrine of reincarnation when they've heard about it for the first time. It comes as a shock, something that's hard to adjust to our modern thinking. But many people have told me that once they heard about it and sensed its meaning, they couldn't give it up. There was something in themselves that began to stir, something that seemed to tell them from long ago and far away that there is a truth here. So it was with the idea of ritual. When the candidate passing through the ceremonies went through these great cosmological dramas as they were enacted for him, there was a stirring within himself. Something came out of him. Something made sense in his own nature. And he took this ritual and he ensouled it with his own life. We know that the great temple of Eleusis in Greece, where the great Eleusinian mysteries were given, presented these ritualistic pageantries probably more magnificently than any ritual that we have ever known in the modern world, unless it might possibly be High Mass at St. Peter's in Rome. But there was a tremendous religious impact. These great dramas were superlatively presented in magnificent surroundings by highly skilled technicians in all forms of artistry and stagecraft. The dramas that they presented were as though the curtains of the universe actually opened, and man seemed to see all of the deities, all of the sovereign powers, moving in their magnificent triumph through space and time. It was a great experience, and to many persons it was a highly valued one. But most of all, it stirred something. It moved this powerful render within the person. It made him suddenly sense his universal citizenship. There moved out of him an acceptance that was not born of the pleading of someone that he should join the faith, but was born out of the inability to resist the great cosmological, mathematical dramas that were based upon natural law, that unfolded in the perfect sequence of the cosmic pattern itself, and in which all of the participants became the personifications of universal principles in action. This type of indoctrination left almost no resistance in the individual. Now, we have many records of the attitudes of those who were initiated. And it is certain that it would be hard to assume that what constituted the great Dionysiac or Eleusinian or Zabasian rites could merely have been modern theater as we know it. Yet we experience something even in modern theater. If theater is great, if theater is tremendously done, it moves us because it deals with certain kinds of facts. It dramatizes situations within our common experience. Therefore, we are easily lost in drama if this drama is effectively presented. We forget that we are sitting in a theater seat. We forget that we are looking at actors, and we suddenly see fragments of life vitalized before us. It is very important, therefore, that theater should recognize its tremendous power to create this visualization, to create this experience within the person. It is pretty obvious that men of the caliber of Socrates or Plato or Aristotle or Euclid would not be overwhelmed by some ordinary theatrical presentation. It would not be likely that men of this kind and many other very solid thinkers, great mathematicians, astronomers, physicists of those times, highly enlightened men, would simply become overwhelmed by a theatrical spectacle and would assume that in this spectacle they were seeing anything either transcendent or metaphysical. Yet every one of those who attended these rituals came out with the same report, that they had really been present when a divine spectacle was unfolded before them, that they actually experienced the presence of the gods as a mystical power in their own lives. Now, everyone involved knew these actors were wearing masks. Everyone knew this. Everyone knew that perhaps Zeus was being played by a great priest of the temple. No one doubted it for a moment, and no one assumed that Zeus came down from the sky and inhabited that actor. And yet the beholder had an experience in himself. Something came out of his own consciousness and ensouled that actor, because he was in the presence of what we might term today archetypal drama. He was in the presence of a high form of specially developed psychodrama. He was not participating in unloading his own libido. He was in the presence, however, of a psychological situation that touched him, that moved him from his material foundations, and caused a tremendous upsurge of internal content. The only possible way in which such an upsurge could come legitimately and have a lasting and constructive effect is that the drama had to stir a reality in that person. It had to constitute a religious experience. and it had to be valid enough to hold the mathematician, the orator, the physician, and the lawyer, the judge, the great leader in the various departments of life. So in this ritual, we certainly do have something coming out from the person, from below the threshold of his consciousness. What has been called recently the authority of the unconscious in the controlling and directing of life. This authority of the unconscious seems to require a key. Some way man has lost the ability to immediately and inevitably interpret the circumstances around him correctly. This is largely due, perhaps, to the fact that he is more and more surrounded by circumstances caused by his own kind. He is not surrounded by nature as much as he is by freeways, by great buildings, by traffic snarls, and things of this nature. He is therefore not able to look upon nature as the ancient did and see in nature the presence of a divine power. He looks out into nature and sees nothing but shopping centers and subdivisions. This is not quite the same thing. It does not call out of his consciousness anything. He goes to poor theater or meaningless theater. Instead of his consciousness being vitalized, his entire mood is depressed. He sees constant violence, the evidence of man's inhumanity to man, and he is further depressed. But where in this entire picture does he come into contact with any moving factor that restores his sense of internal value, that makes his heart sing with realization, that makes his consciousness leap forward to embrace that which is like unto itself? These experiences we do not normally have. They were sacred even in those days, and they were not offered to the profane. But any person who was willing could earn the right to participate. He did not have to be born in a certain class. He had the right to participate if he would prepare himself adequately and accept the instruction that was necessary to make the experience meaningful to him. Out of this type of dramatic rite, therefore, we seem to see the long shadow of a great deal of religious writing and literature. I think there is no doubt in the world that a considerable part of so-called sacred books were originally taken from mystery rites and rituals. A great many stories that seem highly dramatic in sacred writing were probably originally actually religious theater. There are even sections of the Old Testament, which it is believed, were ancient Jewish religious theater. And the stories such as the Song of Solomon was probably originally a play or a religious drama. Actually, then, the age of fables, the mythologies, the prehistories of peoples with their lore and legendary, most of this had to do with religious ritual. It had to do with experiences which persons found as living, vitalizing elements in the development of their own characters. Actually, religious ritual, of course, is this stimulation of internal. Sufficiently stimulated, it just doesn't go to sleep again. And those who pass through the great religious mysteries were termed initiates because they had received certain insight. They were originally called mystics because they saw through a veil. Later, however, in the higher degrees of the rites, the veil was removed, and they beheld the gods face to face. This is the description given by Apuleius in his description of the mysteries. Now, we do not assume that deities actually descended. This would be a little too complicated. But we do assume that the deity symbols emerged as great archetypal patterns within human consciousness. Man reached forth and gloriously accepted the fact that the universe was ensouled, that there were tremendous spiritual powers at the root of life, that these powers were continually operating, that the universe was itself a living example of a sublime process. To have this experience, to be rooted sincerely and devoutly in it, was to have a new attitude toward life, was to have a new dedication. And the initiates of these rites received some kind of a tremendous psychic uplift that went with them for the rest of their days. For these rituals became almost like visions, visions from within themselves of sacred matters. Occasionally persons are given these internal visions. They become very meaningful and very purpose-making in the career of the person. Now, the point that we want to particularly emphasize, of course, at this time is what can we say, what can we work out that will cause this older pattern to have some distinct meaning for us here and now. We know that these ancient rituals are no longer performed. We know that the temples of the rites are gone. But we also realize that gradually, with the loss of these rituals and so forth, something was lost in man. And as a result, for the last 2,000 years, as our material civilization has ascended, our spiritual culture has consistently lowered. One of the reasons why it is at a low ebb is certainly that the principal source of it in man himself is not used. Gradually, through the course of life as we live it, the spiritual core or the subconscious archetypal nature is more and more restricted by circumstances rather than encouraged to emerge and become a dominant in life. Every day, the spiritual pattern of our lives is further limited by our conduct, by our thought, and by our emotion. Instead of thinking in terms of releasing, we are thinking in terms of imposing the society that we know upon the inner life of the individual, trying to force him into a state of conformity. Conformity not with archetype, but conformity with the delinquencies of civilization. Instead of man being born for the purpose of making his civilization better, he is born with the immediate need to adjust to the civilization as it is. Well, it isn't much, therefore adjustment is not especially profitable or successful. Around us are all the instruments that were used to make these initiation rituals valuable. But today they are no longer serving any such purpose. One of the great elements of ancient ritual was music. We still have great music, but this great music is no longer part of a pattern. We no longer listen for a reason. We no longer have a sense of insight with it. We are very happy if the music makes us a little more comfortable, a little more peaceful, or takes our minds off of some of the burdens of life. We are not able to use it to unlock archetype, or at least we have forgotten that that was its primary function. Also, we have done the same with art. Art, which originally supplied the great setting for the sacred drama, has now lost its overtones. It's lost its meaning and its power to make us better people. Therefore, we struggle with art today. We are trying desperately to find what is artistic about it. And if we achieve that, we consider ourselves fortunate. I've heard a great many people in art galleries looking at something, and one will say to the other, well, I guess it's good, but I don't know what it means. He guesses it's good because it's there. Actually, it's not there because it's good at all. It's there because somebody who has a large name painted it, and also it may be there because the curator of the gallery doesn't know what good is, and as a result of that has no way of judging. Today, if it's expensive, it's good. But some of the greatest art in the world is still folk art, which is unrecognized, but which has a wonderful sincerity about it. It is one thing for a primitive person to be primitive. It is entirely another thing for a sophisticated person to become decadent and think he's primitive. This is one of our problems with modern art. We have the same with literature. These things are the great instruments. We have the tremendous facts, for example. Nearly everyone who goes to the campus of a great university is impressed with the architecture. Maybe it's a little strange, but at the same time, here is this vast monument which announces proudly that it's going to graduate 25,000 students in this or that or something else. We are impressed. We sort of feel that here we come into the altars of some higher knowledge. But the impression disappears all too rapidly. 3 months on the campus and the impression is gone. The individual finds himself in what might be termed an educational machine. That the purpose of this education is to assist him to make money. It's not to assist him to be a better person, primarily. All the overtones that might cause this education to become a marvelous director of life is missing. So the initiation ritual factor is not there, although the means to produce it and the means to perpetuate it are available. Much, much more money is spent on education today than in any other time in history. But the great purpose of education has been overlooked. Perhaps this idea of education, we have mentioned before, of course, that the Latin form, educo, simply means to draw forth or to bring out of the person. That education is to release something in man. Now, there may be some question as to whether we can release pure Greek or good Latin. There is much question as to whether we can release technique on a musical instrument or the sudden skill to paint a great picture. Release doesn't necessarily mean that we can release an exact science without the person studying it. But what is beneath all this, and what the mystery sought to release, was primary knowledge. The essential knowledge that man must possess before learning can mean anything. If he doesn't have this primary knowledge, learning can even become dangerous, as it has with us. So the great release is this release of consciousness, by means of which the person recognizes that he is a citizen of the universe, with the problems, the opportunities, and responsibilities of this citizenship. That it is his duty, spiritual, moral, and physical, to equip himself for an enlightened life, a life of value, not in terms merely of income, but in terms of contribution to the continuing advancement and progress of his kind. These things have been reduced in meaning. I've heard professors get up before graduating classes and tell them that they had been instructed so that they could go forth and advance culture. But what he really meant was that they were going to go forth, build more buildings, build more bridges, become physicians and lawyers, and keep on with the various policies that we know. This contribution was not essential. It was to fill the thinning ranks emptied by age. It was not to bring forth or forward the great enlightenment in these areas of knowledge. This lack of the essential meaning, therefore, is the thing that it seems to me was the contribution of ritual. It was this tremendous impact by which good and evil were separated in the consciousness of the person. in which he saw suddenly that which was proper for himself, proper for his kind of creature, and that this propriety he must maintain. That he must therefore be as skillful as he can be, but he must always be honorable. He must be as rich as he can get to be, but he must always be honest. He must have as much comfort as he can earn, but he must never detract from the safety or comfort of other people. He was to go as far as he could go, always in terms of how much good could be accomplished, but must always stop short of injuring anything. This type of insight we just don't have. And it's very hard for the average person to force such insight upon young people because of the compound pressure of civilization. So what is really happening in the modern world is this, that there comes a time in the life of most thoughtful persons when the archetype inside of himself cries out for recognition. This cry may come in some cases quite early in life. In most cases, however, it rises after the person has personally experienced the insufficiency of what he knows, or the insecurity of what he is. Maybe he's 40, 50, 60 years old before this experience comes home with full pressure. But suddenly the person experiences the need of greater insight. Thus nature, by its own chemistry, is pressing him toward the gate of the ancient sanctuary. He is being moved by the same general situation that moved the candidate to seek admission into the mysteries. In those days it was better regulated than it is now, and probably most initiates came to sense this need earlier in life than the person does today. Perhaps life was more simple and needs were more clear-cut and obvious. But today, each person comes to that period in his life when he must either draw upon his own internal, this archetypal unconscious, or perish. This doesn't necessarily mean that he'll drop dead, but it means that value begins to diminish too rapidly. It means that the reasons for life fade away. And unless this archetypal need is met, we begin to have the disillusioned person, the discouraged individual, the one who finally sells out to circumstances because he has no clear vision of how to fight circumstances. So in the older generation group, and even in those of younger years, there is confusion, wandering about, crying in the darkness, asking in a strange way for help, even though perhaps the person is not religious. Somehow he feels his need, and he looks around to society, hoping that society will fulfill that need. But instead of fulfillment, he finds sophistication. He finds some persons who will ridicule his need. Others will ignore it. Others will try to indoctrinate him from the outside with all kinds of ideas that will not help. But still, we all of us come at some time in life to the threshold of this unconscious in ourselves. And here we lack the symbolism of ritual. We lack the great state drama or pageantry that would perhaps open the door just a little further and let the inner life come forth to rejoice in some union with that which is good. Because we lack this kind of release, we must face in a different way and according to the conditions of our own times this sudden hunger that develops. For this hunger actually is the anticipation of our own maturity. It means that at that moment when we begin to search for something more real, that at that moment we've grown up. If we never come to that need in this life, that means that we have never attained that degree of maturity. But nearly always some circumstance, some pressure, some fatalistic condition set up in nature brings us face to face with the need that can only be provided from within ourselves. Now, what are we going to do in a case of that nature, considering that we do no longer have ritualistic institution, or no longer have the means of satisfying this need as our ancient forebears once were able to do? There seems to be only one possible way in which we can solve this problem, and that is by the continuous use of our own individual consciousness. As this need develops within ourselves, we do reach out to some degree. We reach out and we find ideas. Sometimes they're not the best ones, but they are something that seems to meet the need at that moment. Because we lack discrimination, we are unable to know what is best. That is why in ancient times the initiation rites were never given to an individual until he was first conditioned as to what constituted true and real need. So today we have the same problem. If the need is felt, the fulfillment of this need must follow in two steps. It must follow by, first of all, becoming capable of understanding the nature of our own need, the nature of our own longing or yearning for greater knowledge. And the only way that this is usually possible is for the person to begin some thoughtful study in the area of his need. This does not mean that he has to take up some dogmatic area of study and try to perfect himself in it, but to attempt to follow intuition or mystical inclination without some foundation in mature fact is usually to become more confused and perhaps even more psychotic before it's all over. So if this need arises, I feel that everyone who senses this need should begin not by the immediate fulfilling of the need, but by a preparational procedure. And most persons who want to get further along in the release of inner consciousness should dedicate at least from 3 to 5 years of work in the process of understanding the heritage of the world's essential wisdom. They should have a sufficient knowledge of religion and philosophy and the principles of basic sciences, so that they are able to proceed to the fulfillment of the need with certain criteria, with certain censorship over their own minds. I know so many cases of persons who have gradually reached a highly psychic state in which they have visions and messages and all these things, but they do not know what to do with them. They do not know whether they are false or true, and they have no way of determining what is the best way to use knowledge. This means that they have not subjected themselves to the necessary preliminary discipline. The whole ritual system was based on self-discipline. This is especially valuable today where the person does not receive discipline from family or from tradition. Our way of life today does not prepare the person for the next step. He not only has to take the step, but he has to prepare himself for it. And discipline means for him psychologically to go back and relive his whole life. The person who expects to step forward must therefore build the foundation that he never got. And this means that in 3 or 4 years he is able, through thoughtfulness and through care, to repair the failure of society to prepare him for maturity. He cannot do this just by wishing it was that way or hoping it will happen. There are things he should have been taught at 6 which he may have to teach himself at 60. There is knowledge and there are fields of endeavor which he should have inevitably become acquainted with, but which he has perhaps no knowledge of whatsoever. Plato always advised the study of three arts or sciences in connection with this: mathematics, astronomy, and music. We would not say that such is an inevitable pattern. But remember that insight or release always comes along the areas of ability. Therefore, as in the case of Emanuel Swedenborg, tremendous psychic and spiritual insight resulted from his mastery of mathematics. There always has to be a field or area in which man knows something about the universal method before he can find a footing to interpret the new pressures that are arising within himself. So for 3 to 5 years, he should gradually become informed on the things which he believes to be important. There's the old story, of Dr. Eliot's famous 5-foot bookshelf. And the concept was that if you bought this bookshelf and read 15 minutes a day, in 2 years you would be a literary expert. Now there's truth in it. Any person who will spend even a few minutes a day consistently working with a subject will in a relatively short time become skilled in that subject. Maybe not an outstanding authority, but a capable person in that area. And I think we might say with safety that a person, for example, who takes the subject of history, studies in his maturity 1 hour a day for 3 years, will at the end of that time know and understand more about history than 90% of professors teaching it. Because the person who wants to know and the person who methodically settles down to a subject learns. Now, if our interests are in philosophy and religion, idealism, this is the way in which it is done. Sensing a need, we prepare ourselves adequately to function in the area of our need. This is the first degree of the mysteries. This is the preparation of the child at the puberty rights. The reason why we want knowledge, what we intend to do with it, what our motives are, what we think knowledge is, what we believe truth to be. These things we have to clearly develop insight about until we know what we are doing. When we have so developed this insight, one of two things inevitably happens. Either at the end of this development, we find the path which will lead us automatically to the fulfillment of the next thing, or else we can make a personal decision in this, arising from some comparative knowledge and reasonable experience in the areas of our interests. We will never be hoodwinked by false teachings. We will never be victimized by fanatics. We will never have these experiences, and we will never deceive ourselves if, first of all, we gain a basic insight into the operation of universal law in the area of our interest. To make this development and to achieve this end brings us, therefore, ultimately to the point where we can release or permit the internal to move out in the search for answer. And usually the method reveals itself before the 3 years is up. By that time, the person in his general consideration has hit upon that which is most meaningful and which most rapidly unfolds his own inner life. Thus he is on his way toward his experience of ritual. In this case, it is the fact that instead of seeing a great pageant unfolded in a temple, he has become intellectually aware of the great pageant of the unfolding of truth in the world. through his own specialized studies and researches. From this, he becomes capable of releasing or sensing the possibility of releasing his own insight. His insight moves out to fill in. The moment he reaches a field of area in which, for instance, he gets certain insights, he studies a great study. He makes a very careful analysis of, for instance, we'll say, of certain of the remarks and teachings of St. Paul. And as he reaches a certain degree in this, and he becomes aware of about all that is on the printed page or in the line, he will suddenly discover his own unconscious begins to write between the lines. Little by little, the breaks in the story fill in. Little by little, the ambiguous statements resolve themselves. And suddenly the person is aware of meaning. Now, it is this experience of the awareness of meaning that occurred with a tremendous crash in the Eleusinian ritual. There was this tremendous awareness of meaning because the situation was set up perfectly to provide it. We are not able to duplicate this exactly, but there is no way in which any individual can be separated from a truth that he deserves to know and is able to know. Consequently, as he goes along, this authority of his own unconscious begins to come through. It stamps its own interpretations. It corrects the mistakes of translation. It also sometimes corrects the mistakes of the original author of this particular work, because consciousness itself becomes the final judge of value. But the person has to be able to release it into an area where there are boundaries, dimensions, proportions, relations, and laws. He may find that he finds a great consolation in Christian mysticism. His teachings may lead him into Platonic philosophy. He may suddenly sense or feel that the thing he needs is best expressed in Buddhism or Zen or Brahmanism. It makes no difference. It is his own internal moving out to enlighten and ensoul the symbols of his own thinking. As he has learned more, he has created patterns. These patterns become alive from within himself, and he bestows life upon the mental progeny of his creativity, just as upon the physical progeny of his body. So the great problem of ritual and the mysteries was the building up of this pattern of symbols, not for their own sake, not to impose upon the individual the belief of someone else, but to create a mirror into which each person can look, and by means of which he will come to see his own soul, and his own inner life will come forth to express itself through the symbols. And the symbols are ensouled. But unless the symbols are adequate, unless the work of developing them has been carried on, then there is nothing to draw forth this consciousness. It is not drawn forth just by the wish and hope that it may be. It is always associated with a highly technical product. And this product is a pattern, lawful enough to awaken the sleeping eternal law in man himself. If he's able to make this adjustment, he can still find all the benefits. And mystics today and in every part of the world use this procedure, which is our substitute for the lost rituals of antiquity. Time's up. Now we have 2 or 3 announcements which I think you will like to hear. First of all, there'll be coffee after the meeting for those who are completely exhausted. There will also be, following the coffee, when you're all fresh and new again, a meeting of the PRS Center Study Group, which will meet to discuss the subject of our talk this morning, perhaps get some nice symbols that will pry something out of our own unconscious. We hope that everyone who is able to will attend this meeting as guests of the Center Study Group. We hope that after coffee you will again return from refreshments to labor and continue with this particular problem. I'd like to call attention also to the fact that we have a new Christmas booklet this year, which I designed in a rather simple way, which I hope is non-controversial, to help people to a little better understanding of the immediate application of the teachings of Jesus as found in the Sermon on the Mount to the problems of life today. Some of these teachings are very complicated and difficult in terms of our modern way of life, and I've tried to make something that would serve as a small Christmas gift to yourself or other people to broaden our understanding a little on this important subject. And we hope that many of you will find this a way of solving a problem where you'd like to give someone an idea rather than merely another necktie. So we hope you'll give it thought. We have our little lecture on vital concepts of personal growth on the table, which we hope you'll consider. Also, we have a few copies now of the lecture on the Great Conjunction in February 62, and copies of the mimeograph notes on the chart of the United States, which we think you'll find interesting. Now, next Sunday morning, we have a subject which I just gave in San Francisco, and folks thought it was rather interesting, called Sand, Rock, and Wood, the Zen of Dynamic Acceptance. This is a highly symbolical problem, just the thing, perhaps, to bring out some of this lagging intuitive spirit within us, and we hope that you will all be interested in it, because it represents a group of elemental patterns used in Zen symbolism. Of course, in China and Japan, there are 5 elements instead of 4 used in primitive symbolism. We have earth, fire, air, and water as the 4 basic elements. The Oriental people have earth, fire, air, water, and wood as basic elements. And this problem of wood becomes very, very interesting. So we hope that you will all be intrigued by this subject, sand, rock, and wood, and will join us next Sunday morning while we unriddle it for you. I think you will find it interesting and helpful. We also hope you will visit our headquarters, visit our library and other places where the friends will be very happy to show you what we're doing and our various projects. And we certainly thank you for being with us. Get yourself a good cup of coffee and enjoy the day with us. Thank you very much.